It looks like the camera is pointed over there. Is it?
It's
actually pointed at me.
Oh, okay. Yeah. All right, let's have prayer, and then we'll introduce our speaker. Yeah, you can come up. Father, thank you for the beautiful spring weather today and for the beauty of your creation. Thank you for bringing us back after spring break, and please give us strength and energy to complete the semester with integrity and to the best of our abilities. I pray that you would give us a good discussion today as we talk about translating hymns and the challenges that face us and perhaps some solutions, and help us to think about this as the world grows smaller and that as Christianity spreads to other parts of the world at an even greater degree. Help us to think through some of these things. We ask for your help in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, so I want to talk today about translating hymns. Some of the background here. So I've taught now 4 times in Brazil. So that's the most I've done in a different country. And I've got a friend who's a missionary in Brazil who actually grew up as a missionary kid. So he, has Portuguese as, it's technically his second language because his parents, spoke English. But he grew up in Brazil, so he speaks Portuguese very, very well. And now he's a missionary again in São Paulo area and has done quite a bit of hymn translation from English into Portuguese. So he and I have talked about this a lot and some of the challenges that he's faced. And then I've taught twice now in Hong Kong to Koreans, which is interesting. And this past year, I taught congregational song. So when I was preparing to teach congregational song to Koreans in Hong Kong, and we were also going into China. So so the whole context, if you don't know the Life Road Singers, it's a Korean church in Hong Kong that sends Korean missionaries into China. So there's like now 3 and 4 levels of language stuff going on there. So they do, so they can speak, some of them speak English, they speak Korean obviously, and they speak Chinese. So there's a lot of translation stuff. So I really thought through a lot of these things, especially, I've been thinking about it. In fact, I wrote an article for a periodical number of years ago. Well, yeah, I wrote an article, and then last spring, the IMB asked me to write something for the IMB's website, and I used some of that material. I'll talk about that here in a moment. So anyway, I've been thinking about this subject for a while, and then preparing this class for January made me really, really dig into it. And Eugene was helpful, digging up some Korean stuff, and several others. Jean pointed out some things to me, and anyway. So I began to think about this issue, because the fact of the matter is, and Korea especially, but this is true in Brazil, that in most missions contexts, the first Christian songs that were available to new emerging Christian groups were translations from English into the new language. This is true for Korea, this is true for Brazil, this is probably true for most areas, because you had American missionaries going to these nations and evangelizing people, and it was natural for them because it was the easiest thing, right? It was the easiest thing to just translate what they already had available to them. That's quickest. And I'm going to allude here to Martin Luther here in a few minutes. This is essentially what Luther did. So this is the article I wrote. IMB asked me to write something about missions and Reformation, and I was like, how am I going to connect that? And the Luther thing was perfect, because here is Martin Luther advocating for singing hymns in the vernacular, in German, but most church music up to that point had been in Latin. So what did he do? Well, the easiest thing would be to take what was already available and simply translate it right over into Latin, bringing the tunes right over from the Latin as well. And this is what most missionaries in the spread of the church have done. It's the easiest way, right? It's the easiest shortcut. Just take what we already know, translate it into the language, and use the tunes we already have. That's easiest. But there are some challenges here, and I want to talk about some of those challenges and then perhaps offer some solutions. Okay, here's the first challenge. The first challenge is differences in language stress. So this is something I sort of not instinctively, but started to suspect And then the more I dug, the more I realized what was going on. And it's reflective with Luther as well. So if you remember anything about your Lutheran hymnody and stuff from your congregational song classes and worship class, Luther translated the Latin into German, and he brought those tunes right with them. And that was the easiest thing. It was the quickest thing to get songs in German right away. But if you remember, right in the preface to, I think it's the preface to his Deutsche Messe, Luther says, and I think I have the quote here in a little bit, Luther says, but what I really would like are tunes of a German character that reflect the language better. And, I always read that and basically got what he meant. But I really believe what he's talking about is language stress. Because most languages of the world, Japanese is an exception, there's a couple languages that are exceptions, but most languages of the world fall into one of two categories when it comes to language stress. The first are languages that are called stress-timed languages. So here's what this means. The syllables of the language may last different amount of time, but there is generally perceived to be a fairly consistent amount of time between consecutive stressed syllables. So every syllable, there's an equal amount of time when you speak. We're talking about spoken language here, okay? Consequently, unstressed syllables between stressed syllables tend to be compressed to fit into the time interval. So here's an example. If two stressed syllables are separated by a single unstressed syllable, as in come for tea, right? But even just how I said that shows the stress timed. Come and tea are stressed. For is an unstressed syllable, so I just glide over that, right? Come for tea, right? The unstressed syllable should be stressed syllable. The stressed syllable will be relatively long. Oh, no, okay. I'm correct here. So I prepared this like 3 weeks ago in anticipation for this being right after spring break, so I'm trying to remember what I wrote. When there's only one unstressed syllable, it's relatively long, but if there's a lot of unstressed syllables, you cram them into the same amount of time. So here's the examples. Come for tea. Come and have some tea. Right? I am cramming and have some in the same amount of time it took me for one word for. You see that? Right? Because I'm basically trying to keep the time equal. So, come for tea. Come and have some tea. Right? I'm with a stress-timed language, I'm emphasizing those stress syllables, and I'm just cramming every other syllable into there. I'll show you some more examples in a minute. Does that make sense, though, generally? Okay? So my stressed syllables are providing the rhythm of the spoken language. Come for tea. Come and have some tea. Come and have some really delicious tea. Right? I'm just cramming everything in and emphasizing those stressed syllables. Right? So this is stressed time languages. Vowel reduction is prominent. I'm not really worried about the vowels of the unstressed syllables. I'm just cramming them together as much as possible. People often describe stressed syllables like Morse code, where we have long, beep, 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 right? That's the kind of feel you have with a stress-timed language. So, languages that are stress-timed are things like all the Germanic languages, English, German, ancient Hebrew, Koine Greek, Russian, Arabic, and Chinese are all stress-timed languages. I'm going to explain these two, then I'm going to show them side by side, and I think you'll really see the difference. The other category is called syllable-timed languages. So we're talking about how the timing of the spoken language is measured. With stress-timed languages, the timing is measured based on the stressed syllables, and the unstressed syllables are minimized. But with syllable-timed languages, every syllable is perceived as taking up roughly the same amount of time. There are stressed and unstressed syllables, but in terms of timing the spoken language, every syllable is generally equal. Okay? Vowel reduction is minimal. With syllable-timed languages, people who speak these languages tend to pronounce every single syllable equally, with every vowel pronounced and everything equal. This is often described as machine gun languages. So instead of beep, 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 this is everything is just equal. Everything is equally stressed. So stressed syllable-timed languages are languages like Spanish, Italian, French, and Korean. Okay, they're generally equal. Every syllable is given an equal general weight. Okay, so let me show you this side by side. And we've got a bunch of Koreans in the room, so this is going to be cool. All right, here is an example of stress-timed languages. So with this sentence, birds and eat and worms, those are the stressed syllables. Those are emphasized. So birds, eat, worms. So if I add other words that are less stressed, it doesn't elongate the amount of time it takes me to read the sentence. So watch this. Birds eat worms. The birds eat worms. The birds eat the worms. The birds will eat the worms. You see, I mean, every sentence, even though the sentences get longer, the time it takes me to say the sentences, generally the same. This is what happens with stress-timed languages. With syllable-timed languages, it doesn't work quite like that. If you make the sentence longer, it takes longer to say the sentence. Okay, so I can't read this, but some of you can. Okay, you Koreans, try this, okay? Say the first sentence. Go. Now say the second sentence. Takes longer. Say the third sentence. Okay, say the fourth sentence. Right? You see that? Right? This is that you can feel the difference. With English, German, stress-timed languages, you can cram in more to the same amount of time. With syllable-timed languages, it's much, much harder to do that. So what happens then is if you're translating from a stress-timed language into a syllable-timed language and you're using the same tune, it's harder to fit as much in, which often happens. So what I noticed when I was talking to the Koreans in January is when an American, for example, took an English hymn and translated it into Korean and really tried to stay as literal as possible to the original, you end up with a really awkward song. It just reads really awkwardly. Or you try to cram everything in and you end up, it's harder to sing. Right? It's challenging. You can fit more in the same amount of time in a stress-timed language than you can in a syllable-timed language. Does that make sense? So it's a challenge that affects translation. Okay, so that's just with the natural stress. So this is where I think this is what Luther was dealing with was the opposite. Latin is a syllable-timed language. And Luther was translating from Latin into German, which is a stress-timed language. So you can do it, you can translate, but if you use the same melody that was designed to be sung with a syllable-timed language and you try to do it with a stress-timed language, it works, but it just feels awkward. It doesn't feel like it quite fits. And I think that's exactly what was happening with Luther. It worked. It was a good, short, easy, quick way to provide hymns in German for the people. But he said, I want tunes of a German character. And I think what he meant there is tunes designed to be sung with stress-timed languages, which is eventually what he did. He wrote some, Johann Walter wrote some, and he encouraged the writing of tunes that fit better with the German language. I think what's happening when we translate from English into Portuguese, or English into Korean, English into a Romance language, and even into Spanish. We're going the opposite way. We're translating from a stress-timed language into a syllable-timed language, and it works, but it's a little bit awkward, especially if you just carry the melody over. Okay, so that's one thing. Then we have even other issues related to syllable stress and meter. So I mentioned, even with syllable-timed languages, there are patterns of natural stress and unstress, in these various languages. But some languages are a mixture of words that begin or end with stressed or unstressed syllables. So English is like this, right? This is why we have, for instance, iambic versus trochaic. Sometimes it works perfectly fine to start with a stressed syllable. Sometimes it works perfectly fine to start with an unstressed syllable. So English has poems in iambic, has poems in trochaic, and all of you are experts in this because you've all taken congregational song, right? It works. Some languages have this. But other languages characteristically always begin with stressed syllables. Korean is kind of like this. Korean tends to start with strong stressed syllables. Okay, so here's the thing. If you translate from English into Korean, for example, it doesn't matter what the original meter is, you're probably going to translate into more of a trochaic feel with a strong stressed syllable. But then if you carry the same tune over and the tune was really designed to be iambic, it's just going to feel weird. And I think that often happens with translations into Korean. I haven't talked about this. Well, yeah, I think this relates somewhat to Portuguese too. Portuguese tends to have a lot of feminine endings. And so if you find the right tune text combination, it works fine. But if you use a tune that was written for English that wasn't meant to have that sort of same ending, then it feels a little bit awkward. Here's what I just said. Some languages characteristically have feminine endings. That's like Portuguese. So if you're translating a hymn that in English ended with a strong syllable, but you translate it into Portuguese, so by definition it's probably going to end with an unstressed syllable, the tune is just going to feel awkward. It's just going to feel that the stress is going to feel kind of off. Perfect example of this, the Korean national anthem. They used to use the tune Auld Lang Syne, which has a pickup, which lends itself to unstressed, stressed. But the Korean national anthem, if you pronounce the actual words, it feels better to start with a stressed syllable, right? So it just feels awkward. Now what's interesting, they updated the tune, but even the new tune starts with an upbeat, right? I even heard this in the Olympics. Sing a little bit of your national anthem. Yeah, so you still have an da da, but that's not the natural stress of the words, right? Yeah, it's still kind of awkward. It seems to me, and I don't know Korean, but even just talking to the Koreans and Dr. Song, who was there, who was really helpful too, it seems to me that in most cases, Korean songs should be trochaic. They should start with a strong beat. Korean tends to start with a strong. So these are things to keep in mind. These are, and if you're translating an English hymn that's trochaic into Korean, it works pretty well. But if you're translating an iambic hymn into Korean, and you want to keep the tune, it's not going to work quite as well. Typically a tune with a pickup note is not going to feel supernatural in Korean. So it's kind of the opposite problem of Portuguese. And so I intended for us to have a discussion about how that would affect tune meter, but we just talked about it, right? This doesn't mean all tunes written for American or English hymns are not going to work. You just have to be a little bit more selective. With Korean, like I said, you're going to want to choose tunes that were meant to be sung with a more trochaic feel, with a strong emphasis to begin with. With Portuguese, you're going to want to choose tunes that naturally allow for an unstressed ending at the end, a more feminine syllabic stress at the end. It's just going to affect which are going to be more successfully translated and which are going to be less successfully translated. Okay, another issue. The amount of syllables per word. Some languages tend to have words with far more syllables than other languages. Here's another example of Korean. Korean has a lot of syllables. And from what I've read and talked to people this January too, in order to cram everything in, it takes a lot of work sometimes. So in other words, and I'm going to talk about this in a moment, if you're translating from English and Korean and you're trying to be as literal as possible, that's going to be really, really hard. Because you're not going to be able to fit all of the ideas in the same amount of space because it takes more time to say as much in Korean as it does in English, for example. Right? Or it might be completely opposite with some languages, where you can fit more in than you can with English. So it's something to take into consideration. I think a lot of here I'm talking mostly about Korean early missionaries. I think they were pretty sloppy in their translations. Well, it's sloppy in one sense. I mean, they tried to be very literal, but they didn't really consider the Korean language super well. And so they literally translated, and they didn't consider syllabic stress. They didn't consider how many syllables fit into a certain amount of space. They didn't consider some of these factors. And so what you ended up with are, you can generally understand what the song is saying, but it's just pretty awkward. Am I right, Koreans? Right? I mean, some of those early translations, especially, were just really awkward to sing. Right? So some languages stress. Where am I? Okay. Yeah. More syllables. Okay. Here's another thing. Important words. Some languages stress nouns as most important. Other languages stress verbs as more important. Which affects where the stress falls in the song, right? This was another big difference, I think, between Korean and English, but now I can't remember which was which. I think. What do you all think, Korean speakers? Do you tend to stress nouns more or verbs more? I don't know. Yeah, I mean maybe both sometimes. Yeah. I don't know, but it's a consideration, right? Whatever language you're starting with, what are the more important words and why? And it doesn't mean you can just as easily translate them over to the target language. That might be the complete opposite of what the target language is in terms of which syllables are more stressed. Okay, so we're dealing with a lot of factors here, right? How the language is timed. Syllabic stress within the language, amount of syllables per word, how do you determine important words, whether the language, languages like English are more flexible in that we can do stressed first or unstressed first, or we can end with stressed, we can end with unstressed, but some languages lend themselves more easily towards stressed or unstressed. All of these things need to be considerations. Especially if you're trying to carry over the tunes, which again is a quick way to get tunes into the target nation. Now, hopefully eventually the people start writing their own tunes. I mean, this is exactly what Luther said, right? Here's now this quote that I've alluded to a couple times. But I would very much like to have a true German character. Luther, he wasn't talking about heart language here. The sort of new ethnodoxology terminology. What he meant was the syllabic stress. It's not just, well, German people feel more at home if they sing German tunes. That wasn't a consideration to him. He was talking about what more naturally fits the language. And I think that's important. He says, for to translate the Latin text and to retain the Latin tone or notes has my sanction. That's fine, it works. Though it doesn't sound polished or well done. I mean, he's diagnosing the problem. The difference here is that Luther, to translate and carry over the Latin tune was an easy way to get music for the Germans, but relatively quickly they started writing their own text and their own tunes. Korea still hasn't done that. I mean, they have, right? But a majority of the song collections are still just translations. And finally, they're starting to write new things, right? In Brazil, same thing. A lot of translations. And again, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that's a great first step. But eventually, we want to follow Luther's example. Both the text and notes, so he's saying exactly what I'm saying in a more, Luther didn't know the difference between stress timed and syllable timed. That's a later way of assessing language, but I think he's instinctively reflecting this. Both the text and the notes, the accent, the melody, and the manner of rendering ought to grow out of the mother tongue and its inflection. And as only Luther could say, otherwise all of it becomes an imitation in the manner of apes, right? It just sounds like you're just jibber-jabbering. Again, the whole science of language evaluation hadn't developed yet, but I think Luther was instinctively feeling what now linguists have talked about with differentiating between stress-timed and syllable-timed. Now here's what's really interesting. This is from the preface of the Chanmika in 1895, which was mostly translations. But notice what they say. This sounds just like Luther. Is it possible to produce by translation a suitable and acceptable hymnody? We doubt it. In other words, it's fine for a first step, but it's not going to be quite good. After toiling and perplexing ourselves for days over a hymn and finally evolving only prose in meter, and sometimes halting meter at that, we conclude that the hymn writers of the Korean church must rise from her own midst. The hymn books now in use simply pioneer the way and bridge the interval until God shall raise up his own lyricists. But that's 1895, and it didn't happen. Only recently are finally Koreans beginning to write their own stuff. And again, I think this is important not because, we want it to be comfortable for them, to kind of feel at home or whatever. For me, it's mostly just because of the natural language, because it's just awkward. You sound like apes, right? To use Luther. If what you are singing doesn't fit the natural inflection of the spoken language. And that's I think, the goal here. We want people to be able to express doctrine and express praise and any sentiments of worship in a way that naturally flows from the stress and syllables and emphasis of the mother tongue, of the language. That's the goal. Okay, so how does this affect translating songs? Often, the more literal the translation, the more awkward to sing, unless the two languages share many similar characteristics. So when, for instance, Catherine Winkworth translated Luther's hymns from German into English, it works. And you carry that tune right over because they're both syllable-stressed languages. No problem. And that's what, where the center of Christianity was in Germanic languages for a good number of years. Translation across those languages was really good. However, what's really interesting is that how many Genevan tunes successfully have been brought over into English hymn collections? Relatively few. And even then, somewhat arranged. Why? Because French is a stress-timed language, or is a syllable-timed language, and English is a stress-timed language. So not many of those tunes feel natural with English. And there's a reason for that. German to English, really easy. French to English, not so much. Okay, so if you really try to be literal, which I think the early, just because Korean is on my mind because it's what I taught in January, I think the early missionaries tried to be as literal as possible. Let's take exactly what the English phrase says in this phrase of music, and let's carry it right over into Korean. Not going to work. You can't fit it. So they end up shoving syllables together. I don't sing Korean, but you all can attest to this, right? There's especially some of those early translations. So what I would suggest, and I talked a lot to my friend in Brazil about this, because he's really working hard to figure out the best way to translate things. A better option is to determine the core message and the controlling images of the source hymn, and then transfer those into new poetry in the target language. In other words, you're not translating word for word. I mean, you can't translate word for word, and not even phrase to phrase. Instead, you're looking at the original hymn and you're saying, okay, what is the driving message of this hymn? What are the driving poetic images of this hymn? Okay, now let me write a new hymn in my language, or in the target language, that captures the general sense, but is not an attempt to shove every single thing from this hymn into this target language. Does that make sense? Which we have examples of that. In the Oxford movement, when people like John Mason Neale and others who were translating, for instance, from Latin to English and Greek to English, they didn't translate word for word and phrase for phrase. They said, okay, what is the dominant imagery of this hymn? Okay, let me write a new hymn in English that still captures some of that dominant imagery. And it produced wonderful songs like Of the Father's Love Begotten, or some of these translations. It's not word for word the same, or phrase for phrase the same, but it's image for image the same, you might say, or theology for theology the same. And I think that's usually the better way to do it. You may have to add some ideas or leave others out. You may need to find a different metaphor in the receptive language that communicates just as powerfully. It's interesting what the preface to the Chanmika said, in that they were trying to be as literal as possible, and what it ended up being just then was prose in meter, because they weren't able to capture any of the poetry. The better way is to say, okay, and this is why we emphasize what we do in congregational song classes and in philosophy. What is being communicated through the songs is not just propositions, right? What's being communicated are imaginative, poetic, aesthetic images. And if we can capture some of that in the target language, you might even have to change the image. You might say, okay, in English, this image was used to capture the essence of the protection and care of God. Okay, what image can I use in this target language that captures the same kind of thing? I might even use a different language in the target language, a different image in the target language, but that captures the same kind of thing. Regardless, you're essentially writing a new hymn altogether, right? And that's why this is a first good step. If a country or a people group is newly evangelized, it's not wise to just ignore everything that has happened in the history of Christianity and just do your own thing. It is wise to say, okay, let's build off of the rich heritage of hymnody, even Western hymnody. But that doesn't mean you're just translating word for word or phrase for phrase. You might say, okay, let me take as an example Luther's A Mighty Fortress. Okay, there's a hymn that was written in German, translated in English, and now we're going to do something in Korean. I'm not going to translate it word for word or phrase by phrase. Instead, I'm going to say, what is powerful about this hymn? Well, this hymn is communicating the strength and protection and care of God in the midst of turmoil and attacks by Satan. Okay, let me write a hymn in this new language that says the same kinds of things. I might borrow some of the imagery. I might borrow maybe the main point of each stanza. But basically, I'm going to write a new song in the new target language with images that fit the new language, with syllabic stress that fits the new language, and all of that stuff that fits the new language better. Right? You really have to be a poet to do a translation, right? Especially if you do it well. You might borrow concepts, you might borrow metaphors, you might borrow ideas, but essentially you're writing a new song, right? You're writing a new song that communicates in the target language. So what are some requirements for a good translator then? Well, you really have to know both languages. You have to know the original language well enough to assess the poetry, and you have to know the target language. I mean, this is why someone like my friend Mark Swedberg, who grew up in Brazil, I mean, he knows Portuguese really, really well, and he knows English really, really well. I mean, he's the perfect kind of person suited to be able to do this kind of transfer. The problem is with a lot of missionaries who don't really study the target language well. They might know English well, but maybe they're passable in Korean, right? They can get along, they can communicate the gospel in Korean, but they don't really know Korean. So how could they really translate then, right? You have to really, really know both languages well. Excuse me. You have to understand poetry well. Because we're not just it's one thing to translate prose. Because if you're translating prose, you might take one language that's in English, and it might take you 3 or 4 sentences in Korean to translate it. That's fine in prose, no problem. You can't do that with poetry. So you have to really know and understand poetry. Okay, here is this phrase in English. Let me study the poetry. What is the poet doing? How is he doing it? Okay, now that I've understood that, let me try to do the same thing in Korean or Chinese or Portuguese or whatever. It's not going to be exactly the same. I'm not going to even use the same techniques because they don't work in the target language. But I'm going to try to communicate the same sentiment, the same imagination, the same poetic emphasis, but using images and stress and techniques that are appropriate to this target language, right? So, which means you got to know poetry. You have to know the languages well, and you have to know what poetry is in both languages well. And then you have to understand what makes a good tune, right? Because what tunes are going to be more successful in one language are going to be different than another depending upon the stress. I mentioned this already. You really have to be a good poet in your own right. You have to know, you have to understand all of this. Someone like Catherine Winkworth, some of the translators of the Oxford movement, John Wesley even, who translated a lot of German hymns. These folks were just brilliant. They knew both languages inside and out. They knew poetry really, really well. They knew what kinds of stress and imagery worked well in one language and what kind of stress and imagery worked well in the other language. But I would suggest if you know both languages, especially like from Latin to English or from French to English, if you set them both side by side, it's not a word for word or a phrase by phrase translation. You just can't do that. It's more an image by image translation, an idea by idea translation. And really, they really are writing new hymns. It's interesting. I don't know if you've ever looked. There was a version of Luther's A Mighty Fortress that was in Miles Coverdale's Goosely Psalms, whatever that was called, in the early years of the English Reformation. And it's not till later that we have the version that we typically sing. You set those two English versions side by side, and you can generally see they were based on the same source material, but they're different because it was two different translators trying to capture the imagery of Luther's original, but by putting it in English, and that's perfectly fine. Okay, I'm going to throw one more thing in here, and then I want to do something here as we close, hopefully. And that is, what do you do when you're translating Psalms? If I'm Korean and I want to translate Mighty Fortress into Korean, it really doesn't matter if I leave something out. It really doesn't matter if I come up with a different image. Right? I might take this hymn as a starting point, but I'm writing something entirely new. But when we're talking about Psalms, now we're dealing with inspired scripture. So there's one sense in which we probably want to stay pretty literal, right? If we're going to call it a psalm, right? So let me put this up here first. We have clear command in Scripture to sing psalms, right? Whatever psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs are in Colossians 3 and Ephesians 5, and I've got an article coming out in Artistic Theologian about this, in which I argue we really don't know. But at very least, we know what psalms are. So we should be singing psalms, right? I mentioned this a moment ago. Since psalms are inspired, though, we probably want to be more literal than the suggestion just made with hymns. If I'm using a hymn in another language as a starting point, it doesn't matter how literal I am. But if I'm going to write something and call it a psalm, it probably should be pretty close to the original song. Even so, people who have tried to translate psalms, for instance, into metrical English or metrical French or metrical German, The more strict the translation, the more awkward it is. It just is. Because we're dealing with going from Hebrew, which had certain poetical conventions and certain stress and certain syllabic emphasis, into another language that is probably a lot different. And if you try to be exactly literal, it's just gonna be awkward. And you're probably not going to be able to capture a lot of exactly the imagery. So let me just give you an example. Psalm 42, as the deer by the stream longs for water, so my soul longs for you, O Lord, right? There have been a number of attempts to put that into English. As the deer, is probably the loosest example, right? I mean, it captures that imagery, and then the rest of the song is just kind of its own thing, right? Apple of your eye and all kinds of stuff that's not in the original psalm. But even sort of strict versification, so Tate and Brady have a version of Psalm 42. That's an attempt to be a strict metrical English version. But it does a pretty good job, and you can tell it's from that psalm. But even so, if you really study Psalm 42, actually Psalm 42 and Psalm 43 really are one psalm. They have, there's a repeated refrain. What is it? Why are you cast down, O my soul? And hope thou in God, hope in God. Right? That happens 3 times, 2 of which are in Psalm 42, one of which is in Psalm 43. So that's a repeated refrain. There's all kinds of poetic things. I mean, if you really get into studying the Psalms, you really begin to see the art of the poets. Like for instance, in Psalm 42 and Psalm 43, the word for God. So this is not even translated in most English. But the word for God in Psalm 42 and Psalm 43, 20 times is the word Elohim, right? It's a more general word for God. And smack in the middle is the only case of the word Yahweh, which is the covenant, unique name for God. In other words, the poet in this one song, Psalm 42 and Psalm 43, is using Elohim all throughout, which is sort of just generic. It's sort of leaves it open, leaves uncertainty, right? I'm questioning God. I don't know why this is happening. And then right in the middle, we have the word Yahweh as a way to say, this is the center, this is the core. Well, you can't translate that. You can't translate that in a metrical psalm version of Psalm 42 and Psalm 43. So not only is it difficult to translate, well, not only if you try to translate it literally is it awkward, but it's almost impossible in an English or even any modern metrical version of a psalm to capture exactly what's going on here. Another example, Psalm 130. Out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord, right? So Luther has a version of this. There are several different, I might show you one here in a minute. But if you actually look at that psalm, and there's clearly 4 stanzas in the psalm, so really there should be 4 stanzas in a hymn translation, which is not often the case. You have another thing going on in the psalm where throughout the whole song, in every stanza, there are 2 references to God. The first one is Adonai, and the second one is Yahweh. So through the whole psalm, which is a psalm of sort of questioning God, there's this sort of back and forth between Adonai and Yahweh, and Adonai and Yahweh. Adonai being a more general word for God, Yahweh being the unique covenant name for God. It's almost as if the psalmist is waffling back and forth between uncertainty and confidence, And he does this in the first stanza, he does this in the second stanza, he does this in the third stanza, and then when you get to the fourth stanza, it's Yahweh, Yahweh, like he's finally reached confidence. I mean, the psalmist is doing this. The original singers of the Psalm 130 would have recognized this. They would have felt this in their original language. And you can't translate that. It doesn't carry over. So how do you capture this in a translation? You can't really do that. And yet, what would I have here? Okay, so exceptions, all people that on earth do dwell, which is a translation of Psalm 100, is a pretty good literal translation that stays close to the original and is singable. So we have some exceptions, but there's a lot of awkward psalms. Even when I was doing our hymnal, Hymns to the Living God, we tried to include as many psalms as possible, and it's hard to find really singable, good translations of psalms. There's not a whole lot. You know, the ones that are exceptions, you know, all people that on earth do dwell, couple translations of Psalm 23. But even there, like Watts' translation, the King of Love, my shepherd is, that's not real literal. It's a very loose translation, right? The best examples of psalms are really loose paraphrases. I mean, think about the most of the psalms that we sing today, English versions of the psalms, are actually Watts, and they're not literal translations, right? They're really hymns loosely based on psalms. Those are the most singable versions. Okay, I'm running out of time, and I want to do one more thing here. Here's just an example. Oh, here I was going to show you Psalm 130. See how it goes. You can see this in the English because it goes between Yahweh Adonai, Yahweh Adonai, Yahweh Adonai, Yahweh, Yahweh. You know, but we can't even really capture that in English. You know, and here are a couple English versions of the psalm. Here is Luther's version. Here is another one. But even here, I mean, the psalm clearly, there's no question poetically, there's 4 stanzas in Psalm 130. And neither of these versions have 4 stanzas, right? And there's particular things I could go in. I've preached this psalm before, and I've really looked at the poetry. And there's specific things poetically the psalmist is trying to do that are not captured in these. These are loosely based on Psalm 130, and they're pretty singable, but they're not strict translations. So I mentioned this. The most successful translations of psalms in sung form are paraphrases. You know, even Luther's "A Mighty Fortress" is a paraphrase of what Psalm 46. Yeah, Jesus shall reign. Psalm 90, the King of Love. Psalm 23, joy of the world. Psalm 98, I think. Oh God, our help. Psalm. Is that 90? Yeah, that's 90. I don't know. Yeah. So those are good, but we still should be singing, I think, the Psalms. I think these are great, but they're not really the Psalms. They're based on the Psalms, but they're not really the Psalms. So how can we still sing the Psalms? I would suggest, okay, well, unless you can sing Hebrew, singing the original is impossible. Singing psalms in good vernacular is a good thing. We only have 2 minutes, and I really want to do this. So the suggestion is chant. And you might say, you would never do this. In an American evangelical church, just did it yesterday in our church. And it worked really, really well. And let me show you this really quickly. Oh, I meant to hook this up to audio. I saw this done. This is the Calvin Symposium on Worship in 2011, 12 maybe. 3,000 people chanting psalms. It was awesome. Oh. And it's not going to let me do it. I'll send you all a link to this. I didn't even plug it in. Hold on. Yeah. They are singing right, I mean, you could open the Bible and they're just singing a psalm in 4-part Anglican chant. And this is Psalm 46, I think. They alternated between the ensemble and the congregation. Okay, it's really cool. I want. It's going to keep going, isn't it? I really wanted to do this, like in class right now, but we're out of time. So just a brief summary. I did this psalm tone myself, and I based it off of Hamburg. But when I survey the wondrous cross, because Lowell Mason based that off of a chant. So I kind of reverse engineered it. Although, because we were doing Psalm 130, I put it in minor. I did it major yesterday in my church, but... Whoops. Wait, where am I? Oh, yeah, I skipped a measure. No, you're doing it wrong. Hold on. Okay, so all you do is, the only thing you have to add, this is straight from Psalm 130, the only thing you have to add are these vertical lines. So you sing all of this, in fact I think I have it marked here. Yeah, all of that to that, and then when you get to the vertical line, that's when you move. So, out of the depths I cry to you, O Lord. O Lord, hear my voice. Let your ears be attentive to the voice of my pleas for mercy. Hold on. Okay. If you, O Lord, should mark iniquities, O Lord, who could stand? But with you there is forgiveness, that you may be feared. I wait for the Lord, my soul waits, and in his word I hope. My soul waits for the Lord more than watchmen for the morning, more than watchmen for the morning. O Israel, hope in the Lord. For with the Lord there is steadfast love, and with him is plentiful redemption. And he will redeem Israel from all his iniquities. It's really easy to learn. It's really easy to teach. I did this in major with my congregation in Psalm 51 yesterday, and it went pretty well. It's especially easy if your congregation already knows how to read together, because you know, if you read it or you sing it how it naturally falls in the regular speaking voice. If a church has never, I've even noticed this like in the worship class when I try to do readings together. If people are not used to it, it's messy. If your congregation knows how to read together, they can sing together. And this is a way I think you also should sing hymns, and you should sing psalm paraphrases, and you should do all of it. But this is a way to be able to actually sing hymns and retain the original poetry, the original phraseology, the original words, obviously it's translation. A chant is basically, I guess a 4-part chant is a little bit tied to culture, but chant is somewhat acultural. I mean, you can, especially if you just do a monody, you can sing a plain chant in whatever culture you're talking about, and it's not necessarily specifically tied to a specific language or a specific culture. Anyway, just a suggestion. We're out of time. No time for any questions or discussion. No. So hopefully that at least stimulated your thinking, especially those of you who are bilingual and might end up doing some translation someday. Just some challenges and some suggestions for what you might do.